Good afternoon. All right. I'm feeling the vibe here. I'm feeling like we're going to have a very interactive, fantastic session. My name is Jake, and I have Nick Amundsen here with me as well. Today we're going to talk about working with managed applications. Quick question. Who here is just strictly a mobile administrator in their environment? Who here manages both sides? Yeah. Anybody just OS 10? Yeah, you'd be in the wrong session. So good. Cool. Why are we here today? We're going to talk about what managed apps are. Is anybody using managed apps in their environment today? A few. Cool. So for the ones that aren't, we're going to talk about what they are, kind of the framework, what's around them, the problems that they solve. It's kind of interesting. With iOS, it's more of a closed environment, so we don't have as many options all the time. But Apple's increasing the framework that they provide in order to customize some of these configurations and customize the way that people interact with these applications. For anybody who kind of manages both sides of OS 10 and iOS, on the OS 10 side, you just kind of package up an application. It's in a spot where you're comfortable with putting it in front of an end user. You don't necessarily have that on the iOS side, but we're going to talk about a few ways that we can accomplish those same goals of having that great end user experience on the device, but still be able to have that framework there. Nick is going to talk a little bit about how we use the applications, how we can configure them, how we can get to a spot where it's a pleasurable experience for the end user and a secure one as well. So first of all, what are managed applications? It's part of an MDM framework. Basically, it's the app. There's a framework around it that allows us to install, configure, manage, and ultimately, in case we need to be able to remove an app. What I want to focus on is managed applications providing solutions, more around the two main pillars of what we kind of want to focus on here today are security, make sure that we have privacy for the end user, but also secure solutions for corporations and any data that we don't want to be in the wrong hands. And then, of course, an end user experience that's pleasurable to make sure that it's an easy solution for them to use. Basically removing complexity and allowing end users to use apps without jumping back and forth in between different applications to achieve different things. So like I said, maintaining corporate data security, maintaining personal data security as well. So problems that we're trying to solve. We're trying to deploy an application. We're trying to get an application that we want an end user to use and get it onto a device. So Nick's going to kind of walk through what that looks like. We can take anything that's an in-house app or an App Store app and actually deploy it as managed. Many of you might just be deploying apps as managed today. We're going to talk about some of the cool things that we can do with that.
Cool. Yeah, so like Jake said, when you ask the question, are you using managed apps, chances are that a lot of you are today. You might not know it. So we're going to go to the JSS and just kind of show how you do this. So there's something called the Mobile Device App Catalog. We go to that, and we add a new app. And here you get that choice of App Store or in-house. In this case, we're going to add an app like Salesforce, something we use here at Jamf. And when we get to search through the API there, we add the app. And towards the bottom here, we've got this little checkbox, Manage App When Possible. Pretty small. It actually means a lot. The other thing there is remove app when MDM profile is removed and prevent backup of app data. So these all are really impactful, and it's something you want to consider when you're doing this for each app because it can have a big impact on your users, right? Then we're going to scope it. We're going to go to the self-service web clip settings there. If you want to customize the description, we can do that. And then we're going to deploy it out to our end users. So they can either go to self-service to install that, or they can install it on demand, right? But those couple of checkboxes are really important. As we'll walk through today, managing an app actually has some pretty big implications.
So we have an application on the device. At that point, there's content involved with that. There's content that gets created in the app or that gets delivered to the application. We call that data at rest. we want to make sure that that stays secure at all times and only gets opened in specific applications that we want to, either from an educational level or for anybody in corporate here as well. So what we've seen evolve over time is, and we'll kind of touch on this a little bit later, is the evolution of through the different OSs that Apple has released. They've opened up new frameworks and they've allowed us to take advantage of those to provide these solutions. So what Nick's going to kind of walk through here is how we manage the content inside of the application using some of the new frameworks and protocols through MDM.
Cool. So Apple released a lot of new capabilities in iOS 7. One of the things they released is the capability to manage the open-in settings, and that's specifically how we're going to manage data at rest. So we're going to go to configuration profiles. We're going to go to the restrictions payload. Under the functionality tab there, towards the bottom of the screen, you might have noticed a couple of new settings. And these, again, have a pretty big impact on your end users. So we've got allowed documents from managed apps and unmanaged apps, and basically the opposite of this. And what it really relates to is protecting the corporate data on the device. So now let's take a look at what this actually looks like on the device itself. So I've kind of got a before and after. So at Jamf here, we use Box to store a lot of our corporate data. And as you can imagine, there's financial documents in there. There's a lot of confidential things. And there's that little button in the lower left corner, Open In. If we don't manage that, the user can basically do whatever they want with that document. There's several apps out there that handle PDFs, Excel spreadsheets, and they can just kind of pass these documents around. Well, we want to be able to manage that, right? So in Box, without any management at all, if I tap Open In, I can export it right away. I don't have many apps on my phone, but I do have iBooks and I have Chatter. The Chatter one's kind of like bad, right? we can send this around the company in a social networking fashion. Not always the best thing to do. Maybe somebody even accidentally can do this. We want to prevent that from happening, right? So now let's take a look at after we've put those restrictions in place. Same scenario. We're actually looking at the same document in Box. When we tap Open In, it says no app on this iPhone can handle this file, right? So that's the impact of what this actually means to your end users by doing that.
Thanks. So anybody using that today? Anybody using the opened-in management capabilities? Can we see how that might be kind of beneficial? I see like 3 heads nod, but okay. I think so too. When the content's actually on the device, Nick just showed us a couple ways to kind of manage that, to kind of keep it in a spot that we're comfortable with, to make sure that it's that we're maintaining that data security. Another thing along the lines of data security is actually managing how the content gets delivered to the application. In previous versions of iOS, we were able to just deploy a config profile and make sure that, or allow someone to VPN back into their organization to get access to certain content through a secure channel. Another framework that Apple opened for us, opened for everybody, was the ability to make this a seamless, make the transfer of the data seamless to the end user, but also make sure that it's secure. So us as IT administrators, we're more concerned. We want to make sure that's a secure transaction, that's a secure channel. And with per app VPN, Nick's going to kind of show us how we can make sure when a user's using an application that's specific to their environment, it will automatically VPN into their environment and transfer that data over that channel, while still maintaining, like, if I have Facebook or Twitter on my device, all that data doesn't need to be channeled back through the organization. That's still private back out to those services.
Yeah, so there's actually 2 parts to this one. The first part is going to be using a profile to define the VPN settings themselves. So again, back to profiles. Under the VPN payload, we've got some new information there. So you'll see in a minute here when we configure that. There's a new drop-down for the VPN type. So instead of the standard VPN settings, we're going to select per app VPN here, and that changes the interface a little bit. We've got that checkbox to automatically connect. And this is important to note as well. iOS has some built-in VPN capabilities, and those do not support per app VPN at this point. So it's currently up to those third-party providers, Cisco, the Juniper, those folks that are making VPN apps. Then we'll put in the rest of the information, so the server address. For the account there, we can do something neat, use $username. And what that'll do is when it arrives on the device, it'll actually be assigned to the user who owns that device or who it's assigned to in the JSS. So that's how we create the profile. And the second major step here is how you actually take that profile and map it over to apps to be used, right? So we'll take that same example of Box that we use here at Jamf. And if we wanted to immediately be channeling the data that's being used from Box through our VPN, we can just select that per app VPN mapping that we just created. So if you have multiple VPN configurations, it'll also work with that. You can only select one per app at this point, but it's a good way to be able to channel the data from that application only through the corporate VPN.
So we kind of talked about getting an application on a device. We talked about how to manage the content that's in those applications. We talked about how to get the content to the application. Access to that actual data now. Another framework, I guess. And again, these are all only available if you manage the application when you deliver it to the device. So another framework that's available to us is single sign-on. This is more driven towards an end user experience type goal. We want to make sure that it's easy for end users to access that information, also in a secure fashion. The single sign-on is the ability to basically sign into one of your applications and then not have to authenticate to the next one. It's a huge topic, can get kind of complicated. Nick's going to kind of talk a little about some of the technical specs or some of the reasons why things are implemented the way they are and kind of show us how to set that up.
All right, cool. So to set this up, again, we're going to go to Profiles, as you can imagine. There's a new payload as well for this one called Single Sign-On. And chances are, if you are using an LDAP server in your environment, that it supports this. Behind the scenes, the techie word is Kerberos. There's a lot of different types of single sign-on, but Kerberos is the one that iOS 7 brings support for. So again, a couple settings to configure. Under account name, we'll use the $username. I'm also going to put Jamf credentials, and we'll see what that translates to in the device in a minute here. My principal name is just the username who's going to be authenticating. The realm in our test environment is just ad.jamfsw.corp. And then we also have to add this thing called a URL pattern. This is a requirement to get this to work in your environment. So if you guys have tried to implement this, this is one pointer that Apple pointed out to us early on, is that you have to have one of those specified. And just kind of a wildcard one there is https://ad.jamfsw.corp for our environment. So then we're going to scope it to our devices and send it out. And now we'll see what it actually looks like on the device. So before we have single sign-on implemented, if a user is browsing to a certain page within your domain, they're going to see this very familiar authentication prompt, right? If they move over to another web browser throughout the day or other apps, they're going to continually be prompted with this message, right? And I got to put my username in every time. I got to put my password in every time. It's just not really fun to do. So after single sign-on has been deployed, we'll take a look at what that looks like. So again, I'm going to type in that same page that we've been trying to hit. And this is just using Safari right now. And I can see a somewhat different prompt. My username's already filled in. I just have to enter my password there. And we're going to get to the page. It says under construction. It's going to be a super exciting page once we actually get something there. But then we move over to a different web browser like Mercury. We put in the same URL there. And instead of being prompted this time, I'm taken directly to that page. So that's single sign-on in action. This is a term that can be kind of confusing, but really this is what it means to your end users. As they move throughout different apps throughout the day, they'll be able to authenticate to these services automatically. So it's iOS handling this in the background. And we can answer more questions on this towards the end. We're going to open it up for a Q&A, so we can take those at the end.
So another problem is, so we've kind of seen some of the ways that we can configure an application. We want to live in this playground, and Apple defines what some of the rules are and gives us the framework to configure some of the applications. One of the really cool things that they did was open up another framework for us in order to be able to configure some third-party applications. So some of the built-in apps, like I can just deploy a configuration profile and set up my mail configurations. or I can, what's another configuration profile I can deploy is,
I think, yeah.
anyway, anything built into the OS is actually really easy for us to configure, set up accounts. But the third-party ones are always a little tricky. Does anybody deploy, I don't know, is there a third-party application that you deploy in your environment that requires setup before you can use it? Goodreader? File browser. So there's applications that it's not the best experience for the end user when they have to, they have to launch that, they have to type in their information, or you have to give them a PDF along with an app and say, this is what URLs you need to type in, or the username and password you need to use. So what Nick's going to kind of show us is this new framework available with iOS 7 that allows us to configure those things on the fly or automatically for those users. He's going to talk about some of the limitations to it, what we need to ask of some of the vendors who are creating the apps. But I think it's a really powerful thing, and if we can get some weight behind it, I think there's a lot of possibilities and how we can move forward and advance that.
Yeah, so there's a couple parts that we're going to cover today. First of all, the administrative aspect of this, how as an administrator you deploy the preferences for your apps. But do we have any iOS developers in the crowd? Bob? Yeah? A couple? All right. The other part is we're going to show you how to implement this in your iOS apps as well. It turns out it's not too difficult. You do have to take a couple of steps to do it, but we'll show that part as well. So to start off, we'll go to the mobile device app catalog. And some of you may have noticed a new tab there. We're going to go through a scenario of deploying Casper Focus in our environment here today. So we're going to go to the App Store, search for Casper Focus. It's a free app in the App Store. We're going to make sure Manage is checked. We're going to scope it to our users. This might be a bunch of teachers that we want to scope it to. And then we're going to go to that App Configuration tab. Now, prior to iOS 7 and Casper Focus 9.1, the way you had to do this was modify your network. We had a KB article on how you could do this using Bonjour or DNS. But we need to set the JSS URL so that when that app opens the first time on a user's device, it knows where to talk to, right? So there's some XML that we've got to put in here, but really what we're setting is the URL so that when the teachers launch this the first time, they're not going to be prompted with a JSS URL. They might not know what that is, right? It's very familiar to us because we talk about it all the time, but to teachers, it's a very foreign concept. So now we'll take a look at what that looks like on the device before and after like we've been doing. So before we have managed app configuration here, the user is going to go to the self-service web clip. We know it's opening in Safari in iOS 7, right? We're working on it. We go to Casper Focus, and we're going to install that. And then it's going to go through this process of downloading on the device. The important thing to note here is that it's just strictly pulling that out of the App Store in an unconfigured fashion, right? So it's going to go through the download process, but when the teacher launches it for the first time, they're going to be prompted with either it's going to try to discover the JSS through those network methods that I mentioned in the KB article, or it's just going to be sitting there saying, where's your JSS? So there it's trying to find it. And there we go. And this might generate a help desk call. It might just generate some confusion. They might not use it at all, right? So we want to make sure this is easy for people to adopt. So after we have managed app configuration, everything's great. We go to the self-service web clip. Again, we install Casper Focus. And in the background, there's two things that are going to be happening here now. Instead of just simply going out to the App Store, the JSS is also issuing that data to the device behind the scenes. And this happens simultaneously, so you don't have to wait for that configuration to arrive or anything like that. The demo we're showing here today is that they can just tap download. The data is already there, so when they launch it the first time, that app is already going to be configured for them to use. So now we launch it, and the JSS URL is filled in, and we're taken immediately to the login page. So that's just one example of how that makes life a lot easier for people. And we wanted to embrace that right off the bat. Bascom is another company that we worked with early on to make sure that they could do this with their app, because there's some settings with that one that become pretty complex as well, right? So for app developers out there, the one main thing you have to do is read this new domain. It's on the second line down there, I guess the third line, but com.apple.configuration.managed. As long as you're reading preferences from that domain for your app, you'll be able to work with these settings. We see things like the JSS URL as really just the beginning of what is possible here, and we think it has a big future. The other thing I wanted to let you know about is that there's a notification for this as well. So if you're an app developer, you can subscribe to a notification, and what that means is when there's new settings, your app can actually act on that. Or if there are settings that are taken away, your app can reconfigure itself in some manner to be able to act on that. So in reviewing the how we do this stuff today, we talked about per app VPN, how to configure that, the two sides to it, configuring the per app VPN connection, as well as actually assigning that to your apps, managing the open-end settings, single sign-on, actually saw what that looks like on the device, and then we talked about managed app configuration, both for the administrator and for developers as well. Right?
Mm-hmm. Sweet. So, why should I start using managed apps today? Well, so over time, as I kind of mentioned, we've seen an evolution of capabilities. So with iOS 5 and 6, there's the ability to install, remove applications and the data associated with them, and simple configurations like preventing backup to iCloud, and just kind of basic functionality that we would need from any vendor. What we're moving to is, in iOS 7, what we saw is increased ability to configure these applications, right? So data at rest, that was the managed open-in configuration that we had there. It's making sure that we can only share data with other IT-approved applications, data in transit, and then also the access to the data. The last one that Nick kind of touched on was the advanced configuration for developers. I think that we really do believe that this is the future. We believe from some of the conversations we've had that everything's going to move towards more configurations and more abilities as long as we deploy things as managed applications. It's where it's going. We really do believe that, and especially with the advanced configuration, with the managed app config, I think is what it's formally called, the possibilities truly are endless. What Nick and I kind of wanted was to see what other people were doing in their environments today, and to kind of see what some of the creative things, and then open it up for questions. If you guys had questions about some of the things we talked about, what's in iOS 7, the way things have been done in the past, and kind of see where it goes from there. I thought we were going to be lively. Come on. I get it. It's after lunch. I get it. I saw a couple shaking heads or nodding heads like, hey, this might be cool in our environment. Would anybody go back and maybe use this today? Start using it?
Maybe you are and you don't know about it?
Ooh.
Well, part of it is, so the developer does have to update the app first to support this.
Yes.
Like the managed app configuration.
Yes. So the question was, the developer has to update the application in order to start using that? Yes, absolutely. So if there's applications you're using or you're purchasing today, push on them. Tell them to implement this. We have the ability to send it down with the MDM server, with the JSS today. So anything that they implement, we should be able to support right out of the box. But they're going to need to be able to provide at least what Nick was showing there. The sessions are recorded, and we're going to have some resources available afterwards as well. Show them that. Give that to them and say, guys, this is all you need to do in order for us to start utilizing this. It really is a better experience for the end user to not have to type that stuff in, for sure. Question is, how deep into an app can it be managed? Are there guidelines or levels as how far it can go? Nick, can I defer to you on that?
Yeah, it's a great,
I have no idea.
Question. Right now, it's really up to the app developers to see how they're going to embrace this. The possibilities, as far as we can tell, are infinite. So when you're setting this configuration, it's completely up to the app developer what they want to do with that information. Here, we're just using it to configure some server settings, but we really think that it has greater capabilities. Right now, when people are using URL handlers to be able to configure apps, We think it's going to move us out of that world and into a world where the user just doesn't even have to, tap these links to configure apps and stuff like that.
Is there access to the settings? I mean, I don't know what you would call this, but in the actual settings of the iPhone or iPad.
Yeah.
Other than writing to the app, like, can you get into that? Like, voice thread is what comes to mind for me. I would love to set the domain. We have our own domain with them. And if that could be plugged in directly into, if I could manage that on the settings tab, that would be amazing.
Can you repeat that question?
Yeah, so the question is, could this actually be implemented in the settings app within iOS as well? The answer there, again, is it depends on the developer, because the developers have their own section in that app that they basically control. So for Casper Focus, when we set it through Managed App Configuration, we could go out to the settings app and we would see the JSS URL that was specified there. It's just not something the user has to put in, right? So again, kind of leaning on the app developers to make sure that if they are configuring the app, that it is also presented in that view. But yeah, it is possible. Hey, Bob?
Oh, sorry.
We went through this process as a developer. It maybe took us a day in total to convert it to be able to handle those preferences. And also, the JSS supplies things like the username, you can pass the username, and a whole bunch of other variables on the fly, which is very cool.
Yeah. So Bob's comment there was just that it took them less than a day to actually implement this. I think the biggest thing you were waiting on is what's the domain called, right? or what do I have to do? Once he had a clear path forward with what he had to do, he was using it, he was testing it, and he was showing me the next day like how he had this working. And it's really a big deal for people who are using their app because they don't have to have the students configure the browser anymore, right?
Right.
So.
There's one question here.
I spent an awful lot of time in K-12, and for, these are shared models where one kid uses it for one period, another kid uses it for a different period. And it looks like there's some pieces here that might allow configure, identifying myself as single sign-on and maybe a connection established to my personal folder, but what's always tricky is having clean up the breadcrumbs for the next gen. Is any of it, in this scenario, are we getting closer, or all those, can we complete that cycle?
So the question was about more of a shared model. So if someone
How do you log out of SSO first?
does that actually need to be implemented in the app? I don't know.
No, so
I don't know.
A lot of topics that were brought up there. The main one that we're talking about is trying to bring iOS into more of a shared model. The frameworks are there, but it's not something that is core in iOS right now, this concept of transferring ownership throughout the day to multiple people, right? The way the single sign-on payload works is when you get prompted that first time, you're issued a Kerberos ticket. And the research I did, it looks like that's valid for 8 hours. And then after 8 hours, that expires. The other event that would trigger that to be changed over to another ticket or another user would be if you removed the profile and added a different one. So the frameworks are there to be able to theoretically do this. It's not something that we are specifically enabling today. Question up there.
Single sign-on stuff, will it pass the credits from the email application if they're already entered, or because that doesn't use a Kerberos ticket, it won't?
Yeah, the question was whether the single sign-on credentials could be used from email to be entered into a Kerberos ticket, if I understand it right. Yeah.
Going from email to in-house web apps.
Yeah. At this point, they're two different credential sets, as far as what I can tell. So it's not something you can transfer if you already have it configured in email. So yeah, and then getting into the lower level of how that works a little bit more. In an app, anytime you hit a web URL, you basically get something called a delegate. We're getting probably too deep into dev talk here, but the way it traditionally works is you'll get a response, and it'll say, hey, this is asking for authentication. Well, when you have the single sign-on payload installed there, you basically don't get that prompt anymore. It says, you're good to go, just go ahead and continue on, and the connection just keeps going from there. So instead of getting prompted, you're just allowed to continue on. It's still authenticating in the background, but iOS is basically handling all that legwork for you. Yeah. In the blue shirt.
When you were doing the Casper Focus install demo and you
Yeah.
Can I still push the manage config to it?
Yeah, it's a great question. The question that was brought up is, does the user have to go through self-service? I'll say kinda. We can push the app to them. It does have to go through the MDM server, or the JSS in this case, for the settings to be set. So that's part of the managed app that's part of the managed app spec that they have to be deployed to a managed app only. So if they went out to the App Store, they downloaded it that way, the only way around that is that they would have to delete the app and go get it through self-service, or it would have to be pushed to them from the MDM server. It's a good question. In the black shirt?
How seamless is this going to work when Apple releases that token-based the new VPP for token-based apps for organizations? Is it going to be the same?
For the VPP licenses?
Yeah, so you know how they're going from VPP to the token, so they're in an organization and employee leaves, you take the token back.
Yep.
Is it going to be as seamless as that with the integration of setting up configs? Kind of jumping off of his question, do you have to go through self-serve?
From the peanut gallery, yes.
It'll be the same process. It still has to go through the managed app through self-service or deployed from MDM. The license ownership will be deployed as a part of that, as well as the managed app configuration. So it's the concern for can I still deploy a licensed app and that managed data? Yes, you can. You can do one or the other independently if you want. Like you can have some stuff that's licensed without managed apps, or some stuff that's managed with configuration but not licensed, or whatever.
Yeah, there's only so much we can really talk about with the VPP licenses stuff today. We can have a conversation later maybe about that. Question?
Well, it's kind of a silly, but how do you tell whether these capabilities are already in place in an app? Or do you have a list of apps that you know that have that in place already?
The question was, how do we tell if this capability is already available in applications that are being provided by vendors today? I think it's got to be a conversation with the vendor to find out. It's probably just a quick support. Hey, do you guys support the new managed app configuration? Would be a great thing. Having a list is actually a really good idea, though. Might be something that we can look into, is having, these are the supported ones. We know it works this way. There's been conversations about maybe even having standardization of the manifests that are sent down, so vendors can kind of standardize around what makes sense. And that's something that we've talked about maybe having the community help us with, or also trying to own some of that internally at Jamf. But those are all conversations. That's a great question.
The possibilities are endless. I mean, it's a P list, so you could send data, you could send images, you could send a lot of different types of information to the apps and to the devices. So we're excited to see where it goes, and we're very interested in being involved in continuing to move it forward. Yep. So, question in the middle there.
Is it possible to adjust the Kerberos time ticket for the single sign-on?
The question was, is it possible to adjust the timeout on the Kerberos ticket? At this point, it doesn't appear like there's a setting for that. Yeah. I would encourage you to file a feature request for that with Apple, because that does sound like an interesting one, right?
We can follow up on that, though. You should swing up here and give us your card. We'll follow up. Middle here?
On the example you did with pushing out Casper focus settings, you defined the JSS URL key, which you obviously know what it is because you wrote the app.
Yep.
How would you find out a key for some program other than what you did right?
The question was, how do you know what information to put in the app configuration window there? It's a great question. Yes, we did write the app. We have a KB article right now for that one specifically on Jamf Nation. It's called Configuring Server Settings for Casper Focus, and that's listed as the #1 way to do it, and it has that P list in there. I've done it a few times, so. But yeah, otherwise it would be up to the app developer to basically tell you what they expect there. And like Bob said, you can use variables. So if they're expecting the username of the device, tying that together with the Casper Suite framework, you would put $username in there. And then it would swap that out on each device, just like we do with profiles.
Just to follow up on that, that's a really good question. This is a newer technology that's been implemented, right? And we'd expect for a lot of vendors to start implementing solutions around it. So we don't totally know how that's going to be communicated yet. Again, like, if we can get people oriented around a framework or the ability to like have some sort of standardization of what makes sense there, I can see that being really powerful. Today, we're not quite sure.
And the other part was that's a version 1. We're really curious to see what people do, what kinds of data they put in place for managed app configuration. So yeah, it's just completely raw right now, and that you can enter in a bunch of XML. We wanted to leave it open so that you had flexibility there. But as we start to see more app developers embrace this, the thought is that we could probably put a better UI around that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Are all the payload variables supported in the app configuration documented somewhere?
Yes. The question was if all of the variables that are supported in the app configuration are documented. They are documented in the administrator's guide. There's 3 separate sections in there where you'll see references to variables, computer profiles, mobile device configuration profiles, and then managed app configuration has its own section as well.
Yeah.
Capabilities or roadmap about managing iCloud activation log, Find My iPad, Find My iPhone, that kind of stuff.
The question was about anything on the roadmap about managing iCloud, activation lock, and Find My iPhone. I don't believe that those currently fall into the MDM spec. So one thing that we really believe in and that we continue to drive on is we try to always use the Apple provided technologies. And when those frameworks aren't necessarily in place for us to integrate with, we tend to shy away from it because we really do believe that they build the products that are fantastic for end user experiences, and we don't necessarily always want to make things more complex for them. So today, that's not currently on the roadmap. If frameworks or if abilities are opened up for us, we will absolutely do that. The question was if Apple has indicated they're moving that direction. I mean, with what we've seen as far as the evolution of capabilities, as far as managed apps go, I wouldn't say it's impossible. I guess I'm not sure. They haven't. We're not privy to that information, unfortunately.
So the only way to manage an app is through self-service?
There are 2 ways. The only way to manage, the question was, the only way to manage the app is through self-service. And I guess the response to that is that the only way to manage it is through an MDM provider. And since the Casper Suite is one of those, you can deploy it either on demand. So when you go to the mobile device app catalog and select an app that you want to deploy, you have 2 options. You can either prompt the user to install, or you can make it available in self-service. And using either one of those 2 methods can deploy it in a managed fashion. Does that help?
It does not need to be deployed through self-service.
It does not need to be deployed through self-service, but it does have to be deployed through Casper.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm an 8th grade student, and I see on my self-service iPad, the app that I want certain apps on.
Yep.
If I just go to the iTunes store and get that app versus going to self-service, will that app be managed?
No.
The app needs to be distributed through the MDM vendor in order to be managed.
The 8th grade student's going to figure this out in 2 days. That I can have the same apps, but they're not managed.
Yep, for them to install an unmanaged app, absolutely. They'll be able to go to the App Store and do that. There's reporting technologies around it to be able to report on that, and we can always redeploy that application as managed.
Yeah, the question was, is there any integration with single sign-on and the iCloud keychain, I think? The answer to that is I don't know. It's a very new thing, single sign-on, just the ability to configure that for end users is brand new in iOS 7. Can't speak to Apple's roadmap. It'd be interesting, I think.
Way in the back.
Yeah, so right now, when you prompt the user to install, they have to hit the install button. Is there a way, or do you think in the future they'll have it so it's background install? That the user wouldn't have to do anything, it's just there?
Yeah, the question is, right now, the users have to tap the install button when you deploy an app to them on demand. Is there a way to automate that? In iOS 7, one thing we have seen is that if the device is supervised, The first time that the user installs an app, they will be prompted, but subsequent times, it will just push to them in the background. So even if the device is locked, it can be pushed to them, and we've confirmed that, but they do have to authenticate that first time.
That's only if it's supervised configurator, or?
Supervised, I'll say, right? Supervised, is that fair?
Any other questions? No?
This has been a great discussion. We really appreciate all of you guys showing up here today, and the great questions that you asked, I think, really helped drive this discussion. One thing I wanted to note is that we do have a tech paper that is hot off the press that we'll be attaching to the presentation in Jamf Nation. So feel free to check that out as well. It has some more details on how to go about configuring these things in your environment.
Yeah, if you guys have other questions, there's a couple Apple-specific related questions. Come up and find us, and we can have a conversation about that for sure. But thank you.